Invisible divisions in diplomacy may appear to bear no relevance on the outcome of a game. However, these imaginary lines that separate pre-game, early game, mid-game, and end-game are unspoken moments that dictate the need for a shift in your gameplay. David Hood is joining us to discuss these subtle and unspoken divisions, here on Legendary Tactics. Two goals that I'd like to achieve in this video are to identify the main divisions of a game and, more importantly, to suggest how players should adjust and place emphasis on their negotiation style, tactics, and strategies based on which phase of the game they're in. One reason it's important to dissect the parts of a diplomacy game is because you can't move on to the next stage if you're unsuccessful in an earlier one. You simply can't participate in the endgame if you aren't aware of what's happening in all the phases before it. Before David joins us, let's loosely establish what we mean by the four parts of a diplomacy game. First, the pre-game phase is often overlooked, but it's a vital part of this game. Before your first orders are executed, players are given a chance to communicate with their opponents. This is when players establish their direction, choose their opening orders, offer first impressions, decide what style of play they'll use, or what archetype they'll be invoking, and forge tentative alliances. This phase happens entirely in the press, or verbally. Second, we have the early game, which is often focused purely on survival and forging alliances. Units are limited, there are plenty of neutral centers available, alliances are tenuous and fluid, and conflicts are mostly optional. The early game usually forces the preliminary stab around the spring of 1902, and I would argue that the early game ends when the First Nation has been evicted from Europe and from the game. Third, we have the mid-game. It's marked by the formation and consolidation of clear alliance structures. Nations have now customized their unit types and their direction. It's also the stage in the game where initial alliances often shift. Powers that were geographically distant in the early game may now have contact with each other. And I would also suggest that the mid-game is characterized by one power beginning to emerge as a board leader. Lastly, we have the endgame, which focuses on either an attempt to solo a board or to prevent another player from achieving a solo. If you haven't been eliminated by this point, you're aiming for either a victory or a draw. I'll put a link up above to the video titled How to Win at Diplomacy that focuses almost exclusively on this phase of the game. For those of you who haven't seen David Hood as the anchor on the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, or if you haven't had the chance to read any of his scholarship, he is on the front lines in the diplomacy world, promoting, analyzing, and reinvigorating this hobby. Thanks for joining us, David.
Glad to be here, fella.
There's so much we could discuss about each nation's individual relationship with each phase of the game, or even we could just haggle over the somewhat arbitrary divisions in the game. But the main focus today will be first to identify the anatomy of a diplomacy game, and I think more importantly, to understand how gameplay should change in each phase. So before we get into that, though, I'm curious about what your diplomacy origin story is. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in the game and how you came to be prominent in the diplomacy world?
Well, I don't know about prominent, but I've certainly been around the hobby for a long time, if that's what you mean. But when I was in high school, my friends and I played a lot of Risk, sort of had a little club that we played on a weekly basis, and we just got tired of the dice. You know, the luck determining the game seemed tiresome to us. And one of my buddies said, well, I think my dad's got a game that doesn't have any luck in it, but it's a strategy game. So we all went to his house and looked for it and couldn't find it, went out and bought a copy, and we sort of never looked back from there. We started playing on a regular basis, and we joined the wider hobby in about 1986, went to our first tournaments and played by mail. And then once I actually went to the 1987 North American Championships and won it, and then started my own tournament. That's when I started, really writing a lot about diplomacy and seeing my name in print a lot.
That's fantastic. I love that this is a game that dads pass on to sons. That's very cool. I actually had the exact same experience with Axis and Allies, the same qualms with the Dice Fest. But so about your article, so you actually compare the imaginary divisions in diplomacy to chess. So why do you think it's important that we know and understand the different stages of diplomacy, especially given that these divisions seem to be completely fabricated?
They are somewhat fabricated, but when you think about it, all diplomacy analysis is fabricated in one way or another. There's nothing in the rule book, for example, about the stalemate line or about scoring systems or about opening alliances. All of those are things that we have determined by analyzing games over the years. So I think if you've looked at a lot of diplomacy games played by a lot of different people over a lot of different decades, like I have, you tend to see some trends and you see some themes that recur. And I think one of those things is that there is a difference between the opening sections of the game, or the opening parts of the game, when you're deciding who to ally with and trying to take the neutrals and trying to keep from being eliminated. There's definitely a difference between that and what I would call the mid game, which is when the initial alliance structures from the opening part of the game achieve their goals in, destroying their targets or at least hurting their targets. And then there's a time of potential realignment that happens in the alliance structures at that point. And that's what I call the mid game. Now, that term and the term end game are borrowed, from chess, but I still think it totally fits our situation.
So yeah, this is a great starting point for us. I'd actually like to begin with the mid game here, because the main debate about this topic centers around when does the game actually enter the mid game phase. And in your article, you actually delineate a number of markers that signify when diplomacy has entered the mid game stage. So which of these do you feel is the most relevant and helpful in knowing when the mid game has begun? And maybe you disagree with what I said earlier in the video about what the features are of the mid game.
Well, I think there are different ways of looking at it. In fact, in the article, I quote from other diplomacy articles about the mid game and sort of compare and contrast my thinking about it. But here's my opinion. The mid game is really when one alliance, or sometimes even one particular country within one of the two heartlands on the board, has become predominant. So either in the West or the East. So the question becomes at that point, once you have become dominant on your side of the board, what happens next? And answering the question of what happens next is the mid game. That's when you answer that question, because it becomes, a question of, is the alliance that led to the dominance in that part of the board going to stick together and try to project its force over the stalemate line onto the other side of the board? Or is that alliance going to fall apart in a stab, in which one side or the other of that alliance thinks that instead of reaching over the stalemate line, they're going to try to, sort of monopolize their side of the board instead. But I do want to say one caveat for your viewers who may have watched tournament play or played in tournaments. This whole analysis of mid games and end games is really for what I would consider to be a normal game of diplomacy that's played to its conclusion without any time constraints. When you inject time constraints like a tournament does, it changes all of this. And a lot of tournament games never actually reach a mid game because it's going to be scored in a way that makes it irrelevant. But I think for purposes of our discussion today, it's for people who are planning to play, sort of classic diplomacy to its real conclusion.
So you actually make a real distinction between the primary and secondary powers, and I mean, especially speaking about the mid game where one power rises. And in your article, you discuss that mid game. Can you tell me a little bit more about what roles these primary and secondary powers play in the stage?
Sure. The definition that I gave a minute ago really had to do with those strong powers or the primary powers on each side of the board. That is not to say that there are not smaller powers or lesser power, what I would call the small fry. They're still on the board during the mid game, at least most of the time. Some of them are on the board, and their play is really critical to the success of one or more of the larger or primary powers as the game approaches the end game. So while strategic considerations are key in the mid game, plain old negotiation ability, really, such as giving those small fry what they want in exchange for their services, that can really make a difference between success or failure for the primary, the larger powers that are in contention for the win.
Yeah, this is definitely something that a lot of players overlook. I think that how they treat players early in the game can come back later in the game and really impact. And I think you've identified that really clearly, that some of those small players make a huge difference at critical moments. So in the mid game, what do you think is I think early game, and I'm identifying sort of a pre-game stage where the negotiations are really critical. But in the mid game, do you think tactics or strategy is more important? And what distinction would you make between these two in diplomacy?
Let's talk about that distinction first. I think strategy, or the term strategy, is figuring out what objectives you want to achieve within the power structures on the board between the great powers. And then tactics is the art of achieving those objectives with your orders themselves. So while both of those things are important really throughout the game, I believe the mid game is more about formulating the right strategy and something that you can build on both diplomatically and tactically to set up what you hope will be a fruitful end game, which becomes more of a tactical exercise. Although, again, all of these things are important throughout the game.
I think this is a really important distinction, though, because I think a lot of people think that tactics and strategy are one and the same in the game. And I think you're right to separate those and to suggest that at this stage, you're thinking about strategy, you're thinking about where am I going and where am I going to end up. And I mean, the tacticians in this game, the clinical players who are so good at those little minutia and getting the right order at the right time, that's a different kind of player. But it sounds like the pre-game, the early game, heavily based on negotiations. So the mid-game is on strategy, late game is on tactics. So it really seems like it takes a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman to master all of these and specifically to know when to emphasize each one. Are there any nations that you feel that have natural geographic or diplomatic advantages in different stages of the game that players can take advantage of? Or I guess my subsidiary question here is whether different nations should use particular approaches in each of the phases unique to their own board position.
You know, I think this is actually a critical topic for players who are trying to improve their game, is to realize there really are differences between the powers when it comes to something like mid-game strategy. The ones that are closer to the stalemate line, so that would be Germany, France, Austria, those countries, they can find it easier to switch gears in the mid-game and charge across that stalemate line to the other side to give them a chance of 18 centers. They find that easier than some of the other powers. On the other hand, the corner powers of Turkey and England, which we sometimes call the wicked witches of the East and the West, need to plan ahead more for how they are going to get centers on the other side of the board during that mid-game realignment. It's simply further away for them, so they need to be more strategic in how they figure out how to do that. For England, for example, that means how do they get into the Mediterranean? Or how do they get past St. Pete into central Russia, for example? Or if you're Turkey, it means how are you going to get Munich? Or how are you going to maybe take St. Pete? Or maybe take Marseille, you know, before the Western powers can stop you. And then there's Russia. Russia is unique in the sense that it has home centers on each side of the stalemate line. So if the Russians are lucky enough to get to the mid-game, their goal at that point is to push as hard as possible, as quickly as possible on both sides of the stalemate line, because actually defensively, Russia can be hard to defend themselves in the end game because they're so vulnerable on both sides of the line. So that really speed for the Russians is important. And then, you know, not to leave Italy out, Italy's almost exactly the opposite. They have to play a waiting game typically to look for opportunities to exploit, because it's really hard for them to sort of get out to a quick lead or get out to a quick mid-game realignment. Usually they're looking for opportunities to exploit, and they have to be very patient.
You've actually made me wonder something right now. So, David Hood, when you are in the early game, which nation do you want to be? When you're in the mid game, who do you prefer to be? And when you're in the late game, are they one and the same, or is it a different nation in each phase? Do you think there's advantages at different stages?
Well, traditionally, I have always loved playing France because I like the strategic flexibility of France. You can just do so many different things. In some ways, it also straddles the stalemate line, so it gives you a lot of options. But I will truthfully answer your question in a way that looks like I'm avoiding the question. I like playing all 7 powers. I think they're all fun. They're just different. It's like saying, what is your favorite food? Well, I've got at least 7 different favorite foods. You know, just give me a good cheeseburger versus give me a good, turkey salad or whatever it is, and I'll love it. But the question really becomes, based on which power you are, what are the strategies that you need to employ in a particular part of the game? So people that play Turkey the same way they play Germany are not playing correctly, because they really are entirely different powers.
That's fantastic. I don't mind you avoiding the question, because I think I think that's a fair answer. So let's shift our attention a little more now to the late game. What impact does the stalemate line have on the game? I think early in the game, there's not a lot of discourse on where the stalemate line is or who's getting to it or any of that. There might be some people making long range plans to get there, but what impact does the stalemate line have on alliance loyalty and on demarcating the line between mid and end game in your mind?
Well, I think again in classic diplomacy that's played to its conclusion without a time limit that interferes with the mechanics of the game, the stalemate line is critical in the transition from mid game to end game. It almost is the definition of the transition from mid game to end game, is when the stalemate line becomes the most important subject. We all know there's 17 supply centers on each side of that imaginary line on the diplomacy board. So the whole point of the end game is to see if a power can grab one or more centers on the other side of the line while maintaining its hold on its own side of the line. So this can lead to stabs or alliance realignment as players literally count the dots. There are some in-game positions that play out differently from this, such as a game-long strong alliance, pulverizing its side of the board and pulverizing the other side of the board, and then you kind of race to get to 18. That's kind of an old school way of doing things that's less common in modern diplomacy play, but we used to see that a lot in the old days. An example would be an RT that steamrolls the East, breaks into France, breaks into Germany, and then one of them sort of stabs the other or outmaneuvers the other to get to 18. That's something that used to happen more than it happens now.
That's my favorite part of the game. I just love that stage.
Oh, yeah.
So I love that you played competitively in the 80s. You won the North American Championship in 1987, and that gives you a unique position. You're uniquely qualified to look at how did people play in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. Have you noticed a marked change in how people play, or what kind of players are involved in the game, or has there been any shift in emphasis in early, mid, or late game?
Well, that's actually a great question that I have so many answers to, but let me narrow it down. In general, diplomacy play is better than it was when I started playing in the 80s. And the reasons for that are primarily, I think, because of technology. It actually allows people to play diplomacy more often. When I was playing, unless you were able to play face-to-face back in the 80s, unless you were playing face-to-face, you had to play by mail. And I played a lot of by mail games, but it would take you 2 years to complete a game. Sometimes longer if it was an international game. Whereas under the current scenario, you can go and play on a bunch of websites on the net and play a bunch of games in the same weekend. So I think in general, people's play is better because they have more practice. I also think people play better now because there's more resources available online to look up, legendary tactics videos being an example of things that you can go and learn the game and get better at it in a way that we couldn't have done really back in the 80s. But another way to answer your question is, do we have different types of people playing diplomacy? And I think the answer to that is also yes. When I was coming along, most diplomacy players came out of the wargaming hobby, which was a certain type of person and a certain type of interest in the game. And I think now we have people that come from a wider variety of backgrounds and bring different perspectives to the game. So in some ways, the game is a lot more fun to play now because you're playing with so many different people, and you're playing with people that are actually better than they were in the 80s. So I'm very bullish on diplomacy in the modern world.
Thank you very much. Back to your article for a moment. You very humbly claim in it that you're a poor tactician and so not qualified to write or speak about this phase of the game. However, I don't think a player of your stature and experience could be too skilled as a tactician. But do you ever see a time where the talkers or the negotiation-minded players can put those skills to use in the endgame?
Abso-darn-lutely. Even in the endgame, relationships with those small fry powers I talked about, those can be absolutely vital to the solo push that one side or the other is trying to make. And this has to do with motivations, the psychological part of the game. We think about this game as some kind of strategy game or war game. It is primarily a psychological game. If a player cannot win or achieve any decent result, so they're one of the small fry, what is that player's motivation for the rest of the game? Good negotiators will figure out what those motivations are and use them, or even create or nurture the motivations that was going to help that person push to 18. Envy, revenge, the craving to feel useful, the power of being a kingmaker. These are all ideas that can be planted and watered and fed by the skillful player of diplomacy.
I've never actually heard anyone say this is a psychological game to that extent, and I do agree with you. I'm actually really glad to hear that, because I think I fall into the category maybe of wordsmith rather than militarist. So I'm glad to hear that those skills can be really useful in the end game. In the Diplomacy Archive, which is where your article is located as well, Richard Hucknall argues that Munich is the most important territory on the map. It's geographically central. It's landlocked. It's next to 2 other supply centers. It's on the stalemate line. And he argues that approximately 90% of diplomacy winners own Munich at the end of the game. So arguably, every player's endgame should take into account who is holding Munich. However, the Mediterranean is also vital in most endgame scenarios. So are there any particular territories that you view as essential to an endgame victory? Or tactically speaking, where do you think players should be focusing their efforts in the endgame?
Well, I agree that Munich is a good example of a key endgame spot, but it is definitely not the only one. If you're a Western power, some other spots that really matter to you are Tunis, or Warsaw or Moscow, or maybe even in the right game, the Italian boot, the Venice or Rome centers that you can snag. And if you're an Eastern power trying to figure out, how to get to 18, I think Munich is obviously critical, but there's also St. Petersburg or even Scandinavia. If you can leak out of St. Pete into Scandinavia, you're in great shape. Also, if you're an Eastern power, Iberia, Marseille, or even Brest in the right scenario. Mm-hmm. So when you're playing Russia, I would say, which straddles the stalemate line, really the 18th center, or the center, the sort of the reach center for you, could be almost anywhere on the map. It could be in England. It could be in Italy. It could be, in Germany. It could be all sorts of places. It just totally depends for the Russians.
Really, almost anywhere along that stalemate line is fair game, and that's where the fun is. So within the end game, you've identified 4 or 5 different typical scenarios. You call them: number 1, the fair fight; number 2, the not so fair fight; number 3, Australian doubles; number 4, doubles; and number 5, you reference a triple alliance. And by the way, I've been teasing people mentioning your article a lot here, but if people want a comprehensive summary of each of these, I'd really encourage them to go read your article. I read it a while ago. I really enjoyed it. It stuck with me even before I knew you, and I was really, I've thought of it many times. So I'm going to link to that above in the description and put it in the description as well. But I think it's really difficult for us to account for all these different possible permutations. But I wonder if you can offer general words of advice that transcend the categorization of these endgames and that would apply in most situations.
Sure. I think the main point to make is that you should analyze the stalemate line situation and literally count the dots. In most of these in-game scenarios, there are diplomatic opportunities available, either to help you have a shot at 18 or to prevent someone else from having that shot. And if you're one of the smaller powers on the board, my advice there is there's often a way to make yourself useful, either diplomatically or tactically or both, to help hinder a bigger power's objectives. If you're a small power, the threat to throw the solo to another player is, in order to achieve, security or growth or whatever, is totally legitimate in diplomacy, as long as you don't overdo it and do it every game, which there are people that do that. But I think that's actually key to the structure of the game, because you're not supposed to be able to just take stuff from the small fry without considering the possibility that could swing the game to another power, and a solo to another larger power by doing so.
Even the little guys wield considerable power in that stage of the game, which makes it fun. And I mean, something, I think I say it in every single video I make: never give up in this game, because there's always a play to be made and there's always some fun to be had, regardless of how big or small you are or where you are on the map. So I might as well say it in this video too. But David, we really appreciate you joining us today to refine how we look at the evolution of a diplomacy game. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we whip up some fancy music and a flashy outro?
Well, actually, I'd encourage anyone watching this who has not seen your other diplomacy-rated videos on legendary tactics to go watch them right now, because they are actually very instructive and very useful in your development as a player. Yes, I'm talking to you, viewers. Do it now.
It's very kind of you. Thank you, David. And thanks so much for joining us and lending your insights to this glorious game. If this analysis with David Hood was useful or informative to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. We also feature the DBN, the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, on our YouTube page, and I'd encourage you to check out the work that they're doing. It's fantastic. If you'd like to see us create more of this kind of content, please hit the like button too. Thanks so much for your time.